Man, I tell you what, this really warms our hearts when we get started in worship. Both services the last 2 weeks have been just outstanding with just the energy that we've been feeling and everything that's been happening. And that's the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives. It's the work of God's Spirit nudging us, moving us forward to see the greater calls and purposes of our life. I want to just welcome those that are live streaming with us this morning. There you are right over there. We're so glad that you're with us and that every week that you faithfully tune in all around this country, all around our state, all around the world, that you're here with us in Largo, Florida, which happens to be sunny today, by the way. Welcome. We're so glad that you're here. Let me read to you a very powerful story, which is where we're going to reside today in our time of teaching. And it's a story that probably many of us have heard on different occasions. And listen, as I've often said, every time that we read Scripture, every time that we study Scripture, every time that we hear the text read to us, don't check out and say, well, I already know that story. Listen to what God is saying to you today. And you will find out, as we found out and discovered in the parables and some other things that we've done, that oftentimes there's a different message that God has for us to hear. So listen to this story. I'm going to be in Genesis chapter 6. I'm going to be reading from Eugene Peterson's The Message. This is the story of Noah. Noah was a good man, a man of integrity in his community. Noah walked with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. As far as God was concerned, the earth had become a sewer. There was violence everywhere. So God took one look and saw how bad it was, everyone corrupt and corrupting, life itself corrupt to the core. And God said to Noah, it's all over. It's the end of the human race. The violence is everywhere. I'm making a clean sweep. Build yourself a ship from teak wood. Make rooms in it. Coat it with pitch inside and out. Make it 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet tall or high. Build a roof for it. Put in a window 18 inches from the top. Put in a door on the side of the ship and make 3 decks, lower, middle, and upper. I'm going to bring a flood on the earth that will destroy everything alive under heaven. Total destruction. But I'm going to establish a covenant with you. You'll board the ship, you and your sons, your wife, your sons' wives. They'll all come on board with you. You're also to take 2 of each living creature, a male and a female, on board the ship to preserve their lives with you. 2 of every species of bird, mammal, and reptile. 2 of everything so as to preserve their lives along with yours. Also, get all the food that you'll need and store it up for you and for them. And Noah did everything that God commanded him to do. I just have to share with you a funny little story. After the last service, a gentleman met me in the hallway on the way out, and he said, I just have one question. Why did Noah bring cockroaches on the ark? We still have them today, don't we? But you know, this is a huge story, and we're in week 2 of our hero series, and last week I began to try to define for us what a hero is. Does anybody remember some of the definitions of a hero? You know, a hero is the kind of person who uses their gifts, the gifts that God has given them, their abilities, and uses that as a power for the kingdom's purpose. And a hero is the kind of person who sees a call in their life, who steps up and in some instances uses their abilities to bring justice for the innocents who are left in the world. The stories of the biblical heroes, they come alive for us. You know, and the reason they come alive for us is because we know that they're fleshly individuals. We can know and be assured that as we read the stories of the Bible, of the names and the persons that are in Scripture, these were real living people. They weren't a fantasy. It was not some illustrative piece that was put together, but real live men and women who through their experiences of the flesh followed God's lead and made a difference for the kingdom's purpose. You know, if you were to think about today for a second, and I know sometimes that can be a scary thought, but how many of you think right now that maybe you could sure use an opportunity to see a hero or a heroine in our world today? I would. I mean, honestly, I think the world in our country is yearning to see more heroes in the world, in our country as well, that we're yearning for men and women to answer that call of God to come and to fulfill the role of the hero and to bring justice for the innocents and to see things happen that bring joy to the heart of God as we move forward. This is why in the 21st century, it's important for us to be teaching and listening in on a series about heroes, because it's important for us to not just look at this as, well, this happened way back in history, but we need to understand it happens now. And that you and I have an opportunity to lean in, lead into that, and to accept what God might be doing in our lives. So last week, we said that a hero was someone who had a specific vision. A hero was someone who knew what their mission was. We said a hero was stoked as far as opportunity was concerned. And they followed through exactly with the plans as to what God said, that their purpose was defined and what God said, here's what I want you to do. And they made the physical choice to do what God asked. Now, there was a lot of energy last week. I can feel the energy building up this week. There was so much energy last week. I went home stoked. I was pumped up. And I just thought, man, if the world could have just been in worship today. And then all of a sudden, a miracle happened. I think the Bucks watched our worship service. They won a game. And so we see that everything is aspiring. That's right. Go Bucks. We want to do with that. There's a saying that's out there that says, good intentions don't create great stories, but actions do. Did you catch that? Good intentions don't create good stories, but actions do. So my hope is that as we continue in this series, now week 2, on to week 6 and 7, that we continue to build that momentum, that we continue to build that expectation, that we continue to sense what God is doing in our life. Noah is a great person, and probably one of the first stories that many of us ever learned about the Bible. In fact, I recall that one of the first gifts that we gave our kids when they were really little was a plastic Noah's Ark, and a lot of the little animals, or a rendition of the animals. We didn't have all the thousands and millions of animals, but we had a few. And I remember how our girls loved to play with that ark, and it was a plastic cast construction, and they would drag it across the floor and drag it across the carpet as if Noah's Ark was moving on through the waters. They would open the door, it hit dry land, they'd let all the animals out. Well, there was peace in the Martin home while all that was happening, until the day that the girls discovered that they wanted to take that plastic cast ark and they wanted to drag it across their mother's prized wooden table. Now, you can imagine what happened that day. First of all, I did what I often do. I exited the situation. And I was going to the hardware store so I could find some of that, furniture polish stuff. But I kind of imagined for a second, what that would have been like was Patty telling the girls that the ark door was closing. Bye-bye, see you later. I don't know. But our kids, they inform us, they teach us, they move us in all these things. And Noah is probably one of the greatest heroes of all time. In fact, what we know about it is that his story and the story of the flood is not only taught in Christianity or in Judaism, but it's actually taught in all world religions. There is some form of a flood story, some form of a saving action of creation that happens through the floods. So the question becomes this morning, what is it that makes Noah a hero? Why is he so important? What is it that's behind that? And part of it is because he had a clear mission. He had a clear vision. He had listened to what God said, and he knew exactly what he was called to do. And he took the steps forward with that. But he had one big problem. Everybody around him thought he was crazy. Everybody around him thought he was a loon. They thought, what in the world is going on with this guy? There's no way. He's not thinking straight. Here's a little biblical history. Many scholars believe that before the flood story, before the Noah story, many scholars believe that rains did not come from, or water did not come from the heavens, but that water came up from underneath the ground. So precipitation would water things that way. So think about it for a second. If those scholars are correct, it magnifies the meaning of this story. Here's why. Because if they had never seen rains from the heavens come down, then they would have probably never seen a boat, because there was no flood water, so to speak, or no basis of water. So here's Noah in the middle of the desert, and God says, go build an ark, and he says, okay. And he's building this wooden boat 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet tall, with an 18-inch, or a window that's 18 inches from the top. And all of a sudden, his friends, his neighbors, and everybody around him is walking around looking at this going like, what in the world is this? And they begin to ridicule, they begin to chide, they begin to play games on Noah for a second, because they couldn't understand, because nobody had seen rain, nobody knew what a boat was, but yet Noah was on this mission. And this is why he's part of a hero, in a sense that he was making these things happen, he was making these things come true. Noah was willing to act on a vision that God had given him to do something crazy in the world that nobody would understand, but God's plan was pure. God's plan was true. And Noah, not even understanding, never seeing rain, never knowing what a boat is, Noah said, yes, God. And he stepped out and he made this happen. You know, this adds kind of a new dimension if we think about things for a second. How many today have ever been the first to do something, like first in your family to go to college, first in your family to go to a trade school, first in your family to buy a home, first in your family to have children? So there's a lot of firsts. So sometimes being the first in some of these things is really troubling because no one else has done it. So when you do it, it usually raises a lot of eyebrows with things. And let me kind of put this in perspective. I remember when I answered my call to ordained ministry. I was a businessman before that. And God called me later in life when I was at the age of 30. And I had this clear call to the ordained ministry of the United Methodist Church. And what I learned is that sometimes the people closest in our lives, the people who know the most about us, the people who love us the most, it's they that give us the greatest grief. You ever experience that? Yeah. So it happens. So I remember going to my parents one time and saying to my mom and dad, I'm feeling a call to ministry. I'm going to leave the business world and I'm going to go to seminary and I'm going to answer God's call. My mom was elated. My dad looked at me and I'm like, Dad, what's the matter? He goes, I don't know, son. I said, what? He said, am I ever going to be able to tell you a joke again? I'm like, absolutely, you'll be able to do that. And then I started getting some pressure from my business associates as I let them know that I was going to leave the industry that I was in. And where I got the pressure from them was it came in the words of, you're going to leave this, you're going to leave all that you have, you're going to leave fame and fortune and how we defined it in the world today with money, you're going to leave all of that just to be a pastor? And yes, even my wife. I remember I struggled for 2 years, because we had just set things up in motion where Patty could retire from teaching. She could be a full-time mom. We had just built the home of our dreams. Life was moving in the right direction, and I was scared to death to tell her. I wrestled with it for 2 years. Now, on February 13th of 1993, I finally got the courage while she was asleep to let her know what was going on. And I remember it clear as day today. And I said, Patty, here's what's going on. I feel God calling me to ministry. You know what she said? Oh, Bob, it's a phase. You'll get over it. But it didn't, So sometimes it's the ones that we love the most that we catch the most pushback on, or the most grief, or the things that come our way. And we have to understand that sometimes when God places that call in our life, when God is directing us to do something, we have to be at a point where we accept what he's asked us to do. And no matter what is going on around us, that we pursue that and that we live into it and that we fulfill exactly what he's asking us to do. Every hero in the Bible follows a process. They hear a voice of God, or they're nudged by God to do something. They hear it, they feel it, they begin to implement it, they accomplish what God has asked. They have a clear-cut vision, they know what their mission is, they move forward and they do exactly what it is in the kingdom's purpose. But here's the qualifier. When God speaks, when God nudges, when God impresses, puts impressions on your heart, however it might come, the question is, will the person that God is speaking to, putting impressions on or nudging, will you listen? And not just will you listen and hear, but will you follow through and be obedient to what he's asking of you to do? Noah knew exactly what he was called to do. People said, you're crazy. But yet Noah said, no, I'm not. You see, when we do what God tells us to do, oftentimes what it means is it causes change in our life. It certainly caused change in Noah's life. Answering a call to full-time ministry changed our life. We can talk to you about that. And so things that you're asked to do by God, or there are things that change your life. And we all go through this transformation, this change process, and we begin to look at these things. And I take this back to the creation story. And what I find in that is that God created everything. God created all things. And when God was finished with creation, he said it is good. So God took out of nothing and changed nothing into something. So change is a natural process that happens as we go through our faith, especially when God is connecting with us for us to do something for his kingdom's purpose. I have two neighbors on both sides of me who constantly are raising the bar on what lawns should look like. One of them's in the room right now, but I'm not going to look their way because I don't want to embarrass them. They're over there. They're raising the bar. So last week, I got to do something I haven't been able to do in a couple of weeks. I actually got out in the yard without getting my feet wet. The ground had dried out, and so I started surveying things, and I saw Tom and I saw Bob, and they've got all these bells and whistles. They're doing great work on their yards. You see creation coming alive, and then there's the Martin home in the middle that needs a lot of work of creation. So one of the things Patty and I like to do is we like to plant things. Well, I like to plant things. Patty likes to watch me plant things. But we plant things. And one of the things that we really love is the hibiscus. Anybody have hibiscus in your yard? They're beautiful. They come in all sorts of colors. And to me, it really represents what life is through all the colors. And it, because flowers are different colors, human beings are different colors. We're all connected and we're all one, And so one of the things that I learned just about a year and a half ago was that when hibiscus plants, like plants often do, whenever they start commingling, and if you're wondering what does that mean, I teach this in my marriage class. When they start commingling, something happens, and out of that comes a newer creation. So you take a yellow hibiscus, a ruby red hibiscus, and you place into that an orange hibiscus, and when those come together, they produce the hibiscus flower called the fiesta. Now think about fiesta. So it's got oranges and reds and yellows in it. And it's quite unique. And it only came to be about a year and a half ago. So creation is constantly moving in the direction where God is still creating today. And God is still bringing things to be. And we need to understand that every time we see creation happening, anytime we see things coming on in our life, there is usually a call for us to change. To change how we see things, to change how we're going to embark on things, or to change what we'll do with what it is that we've been given. This says something about our human nature. We are creatures of habit. Would you agree with that? I haven't met anybody yet who said to me, I want life every day to change. I never hear that. I'm not even going to say that. As human beings, we get kind of complacent. We kind of get in the rut. We get into another word for rut is rhythm. I talked to somebody the other day. Yeah, we're in the rhythm of life now. Well, what does that mean? It just means you're just doing the same thing over and over. That's the rhythm of life. And so when you think about that, we seldom want to embrace change. When someone comes to us and says, like as we're driving in the morning and we hear there's a traffic problem, the traffic report says, you now need to change your direction and go around all this. We're like, man, it frustrates us. We don't like that. But yet change is part of the process that makes us whole in the heart of God. And here's why. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you are in a situation and you are angry at your spouse. Or maybe you're upset at a coworker or a sibling or a child. Maybe you and your neighbor are competing on who has the best yard. No, I don't really mean that. But maybe you're at the point where just things aren't in good harmony with what's going on. Now, you can choose to just kind of live into that and just let that axe grind inside of you. And you can find out every day when you wake up that when you see that person or talk to that person or deal with that person, you're just angry, 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 angry. But God says this: give them grace. Or God says, remember to forgive as I've forgiven you. Or God says, what about restoration? You see, for any of those things to happen, we have to change. So we can either have a hardened heart with our relationships with one another, or we can allow God to change us, transform, however we want to use the word. God can change us so that we are something new. And when God changes us, instead of our life being built upon anger and axe grinding and all those kinds of things that we do, it's now built upon love and acceptance and forbearance and all the gifts that come in the midst of those kinds of things. You know, we've had to make some changes at the church over the last 6 years. And some of them have been very difficult to make. I'll be honest with you. They have been difficult to make. And sometimes we question about, should we have made this change or should we not have made that change? But here's what we do know. Here's what we do know. How churches reach and respond to people today, right now, is totally different than the way we used to do it 30 years ago. It's totally different than the way we used to do it 20 years ago. It's totally different than the way we used to do it 10 years ago. No longer are people moving into neighborhoods and saying, oh, there's a church, I'll go to it. No longer are people saying, I'm a brand loyalty person. There's a United Methodist Church. Let's go, honey. No longer are we seeing that kind of thing happen, that just because the church's shingle is out on the front, that people are flocking to that. You take a look across the world today, and Christianity's on the decline. And God is calling us through changes that we have to consider and pray about and implement so that we can find a way to communicate to the world today in which the ways that they need to be communicated with. And we need to find a way to connect. I mean, think about it for a second. In the 1940s, nobody living in the 1940s would have ever imagined that in the year 2016, you could sit at home and you could do your Christmas shopping on something called the internet, and you could actually buy the product using a product like PayPal on your tablet. They just could have never fathomed that. But you see how the world has changed. So change is something that's possible with that. It's something that God calls us to do, and it's something that is really important for us. And that's what makes every Joe and Jane, ordinary Joe and Jane, an epic hero, because you're open to the possibilities that will come when God changes your life. So what is it that triggered Noah's attention? It begins with listening to the voice of God. Noah hears the voice of God, it triggers his response, and he begins that process of building the ark. When I'm meeting with people privately, either in my office or in their home or at a bedside or wherever the case may be, the most commonly asked question that this pastor gets, and my guess is most pastors, the question is this: why? Why did my loved one die? Why did my child die? Why did I lose my home? Why am I unemployed? Why am I living through a debilitating health issue? It's why. The second most asked question is, how do I hear God's voice? More specifically, how do I know that this is God? How do I know that this is God? You know, John gives us some pretty good clues in his gospel. And John says, he brings this into imagery. And the imagery still is huge today if you think about it. He does it as sheep and shepherds. If you know anything about sheep and shepherds, every shepherd has a specific whistle for their sheep. So when all the sheep from all the towns and surrounding areas come together, the shepherd can give a whistle, and only the shepherd's sheep will follow that shepherd. They won't follow anyone else. So John is using this imagery. John is saying to us, there's something about this that we need to understand. So John puts it this way. He says, the sheep, who are the followers of Jesus, they listen to his voice, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. So how do I know that this is God who is directing this in my life? How do I know that this is God who is calling me to build an ark? How do I know this is God who is asking me to be an advocate in my community to overturn injustice issues? How do I know? You see, sometimes what overshadows the voice of God is our own ego. What overshadows the voice of God is when we say, you know what, this is what I want, how I want, when I want it, and where I want it. And unless it's done exactly the way that I think it should be done, then I'm not going to do it. So we've got to come before God humbly. We have to strip ourselves of all the junk that makes us push away. And then when we feel the nudge, or when we hear God's voice, or when we feel those impressions that are placed upon us, then we can start assessing what's going on. And here's the litmus test. If you feel God is nudging you to do something, if you feel God is putting an impression on your life to do something, to be a hero, or to engage something during the day, here's the test. What does the character of God say, and what we know from the entire Scripture? What is it that we know of God? Let me tell you what God doesn't do. God doesn't put impressions on our hearts to go gossip about people we don't like. God doesn't put it on our hearts to go and devastate somebody or dress them down publicly because we don't like what they're doing. God doesn't impress upon our hearts to be disruptive and to be disconnected in our relationships with each other. God doesn't impress upon our heart or nudge us or speak to us so that we can create a schism. No, he doesn't do that. But God impresses other values on our heart, doesn't he? How to be in positive relationships, how to love people who aren't like us, how to celebrate our differences and accept the commonality that we have, how to be one with Christ, because the scripture is very clear that Jesus Christ cannot fight against Jesus Christ. And when we start fighting in our homes, when we start fighting in our neighborhoods, when we start fighting in our schools, it's because we're not buying into that system, because we think we know what we need to do, and we're not listening to the voice of God. So Noah hears the voice of God, and he does this. In Genesis 6:22 says, Noah did everything just as God commanded him, Genesis 7:5, and Noah did all that God had commanded him. In the New Testament, it kind of pulls it in a different way. It says that Noah was obedient to God's leading. So not only did he hear what God was saying, but Noah followed through. He was obedient. That means that Noah didn't just hear God's voice. Noah didn't just hear God say, build an ark with these dimensions, and here's what I want you to do. But Noah took action with it. You know, nowhere does it say that Noah heard this great vision from God about what God wanted to do to partner with him in order to make creation something different. And Noah said, wow, that's really great. See you, Lord. No, it said he acted. And that's the piece that we have to remember, is that we have to act upon that. Hebrews says, by faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, he had never seen rains, he had never seen a boat. In holy fear, he built an ark for he and his family. And by his faith, he condemned the world and became heir to the righteousness that comes by faith. So expecting the rains, expecting the floods, expecting exactly what God had told him to do, Noah steps out in faith. Does it say that Noah and his story is something we talk about in 2016 because he heard God's voice? No. It says that because he did what God asked him to do. And he stepped out despite the problems or the challenges that would have come with that. This is why it's important. This is why you and I, when we get to these times, we need to understand that in our life, there will come a time where God will place something in us or on us that will cause us to take a risk, that will push us out of our comfort zone, that will ask us and beg us and move us in a direction to know that what we will accomplish, we cannot fathom. What we think we are supposed to do, we can't imagine, but God can. And it moves us into that. Let me just kind of close with this. We live life in a span. So this is kind of birth and this is death. And as we live in this span, so as we go on this span of life, we begin to see places in our life where things are going great. So it kind of goes up here. We then begin to see challenges that come, and we come down this way. Are you following me? There are times in our life when we're just kind of like moving along, ordinary or whatever. Great event, bad event, great event, bad event. The question becomes is, as we're living through the span of life, how are we going to deal with what happens? What are we going to do? How are we going to live through that? And the question becomes, when we begin to have that downward spiral, are we willing to accept that that's the final chapter of our story? Or does God have something additionally that he wants to nudge us to do? You've heard me talk about our friends Steve and Debbie from North Carolina. Their 19-year-old son, Nicky, was in a car with 4 other boys. He was 19, and the car spun out of control. 4 of the 5 boys walked out of the accident unscratched, unscathed, and Nicky was killed. And our friends Steve and Debbie were crushed by this. It was their only son. And you can imagine what was going through their mind. At that moment, they thought that was the end of their story. We've lost our son. We have nothing else to live for. And then a couple of months into that, as they went through the process of grieving and seeking and searching and praying and that, God impressed upon their hearts to make a difference. You see, Nicky had all these hopes and dreams of going to college. He had gotten a baseball scholarship. He was moving in a direction through a community college. And Steve and Debbie said, what if in our farming community we could do something in memory of Nicky that could raise funds so that every year we could give monies to young men and women who wanted to go to school who couldn't pay for it? and our son's memory can live through them. And that's what they did. You see, Steve and Debbie had a choice to make. You and I have a choice to make. And that choice is, whatever is going on in life right now, are we willing to accept that this is the end of our story? Or are we unwilling to buy into that? And are we unwilling to accept that and to believe that when we choose a different direction, following God's lead, that the story still to come is an awesome one?